I'm primarily, my main hat is as a cardiothoracic surgeon, primarily focused mostly on adult cardiac surgery, so bypass surgery and valve surgery. And I'm in a hospital in Massachusetts. And last June, I left my first actual job out of training at Ohio State University. I was there for the last previous 8 years as also a cardiothoracic surgeon, but I was doing largely with a focus in transplants, heart and lung transplants, and placement of LVADs, mechanical devices. And so now in my current job, it's less busy clinically, which is good because I'm able to focus a little bit more on my research interests as well. So my other hat is as a physician scientist and a research scientist. So I've had and have grants from NASA and NIH. And actually, before I left Ohio State University, I actually had as much as 86% research time while still essentially practicing full-time clinically. But that research included a lot of research in space. Unfortunately, not physically me in space, like this picture might suggest, but experiments that have gone to space. On the space station, over the years, I've done experiments on the space shuttle, in microgravity flight and parabolic flights, suborbital flights. Also spent some time in Russia working on monkeys that flew in space. And then, so my current appointment is at Brown University in the Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. And my research interests surround tissue engineering, skeletal muscle, and cardiac tissue engineering, using it as a model for studying atrophy or cardiac pathologies, and also as a platform for therapeutic delivery of proteins as an implanted platform device. And also various interests on the clinical side, so clinical research with primarily cardiac area, and also outcomes research. And I guess the third hat I wear about once a month on the weekends is as a flight surgeon and surgeon in the Air Force. So I'm a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, currently serving the Air National Guard in Ohio. And if I were to be deployed, I'd be deploying as a trauma surgeon, but I also have what we call flight wings, or as a flight surgeon, so I can also take care of flight crew. And the other hat, which I've been wearing more recently in the last year, I'm a co-founder and CEO of a company that was formed in the last year. And we actually obtained a license from NASA to manufacture and sell their newly designed ventilator. So NASA JPL designed a ventilator to address the shortage of ventilators because of COVID. And so our company essentially has license for that, and we've been going through the FDA process, which hopefully will be done very soon, and working to try to get this out to those who need it, and mostly in the developing world. In terms of how I got here, so as I mentioned, so I've been out of training since 2013, end of 2013. I'm originally from Montreal. I am a Canadian, and my family's still up in Montreal. I went to boarding school in the US for 12th grade, and went to Brown University, where I did my undergrad and MD. So I was in the combined 8-year program at Brown. And while I was there, I started doing some research in the lab, and I really enjoyed it. I actually found a lab that was doing research on the space station. So who ended up becoming my PhD mentor, Herman Vandenberg, had experiments on the space shuttle. So I sought him out because of my interest in space, and liked it so much, I decided to apply into the MD PhD program. And so went from MD to MD PhD. And in my second year, when I was applying to the PhD program, I also applied to a separate master's program in France. And I got into both. Actually, within days of each other, I found out I got into both. Took a year off, went to France to the International Space University, got a master's in science in space studies. It was there that I did a 3-month internship in Moscow. Actually, I studied Russian in college. And then after I came back, finished my PhD, went back to med school, finished third, and in fourth year, I actually got my master's of public health at Harvard as part of my original intent to go into aerospace medicine. So aerospace medicine is actually a clinical specialty, and there is actually a residency program in aerospace medicine. That was my original plan. And during my rotations in my third year, I realized I really liked surgery. And so, and we can go into that whole decision process as to how I decided to finally go to surgery, but decided to do surgery. And I originally did the MPH because I was going to go into aerospace medicine, which usually requires an MPH. But after I decided to do surgery, I continued the MPH and focused on outcomes research, quantitative methods, and went into general surgery, 5 years of general surgery residency, and it was there that I was exposed to and decided I really wanted to do cardiothoracic surgery. Did 2 years at UCLA, and of course, since that wasn't enough, I decided I wanted to do transplant. So I did another year of a transplant fellowship at Stanford, and then finally started making some money at the rightful age of 41. So it was kind of a long process, but I hit the ground running because when I started my job, I had all of this experience, the education. I was already had some grants under my belt, and here I am. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. So before, I have tons of questions, but I'm gonna see if the students have any questions. And maybe while we're waiting for the questions to come into the chat, and you talked a little bit about your vast background, but maybe you can tell us, how do you integrate all these different jobs that you have? Like, how do you, like, do the hospital, do they work with your university? Do they work with the airport? How do you integrate all that so you have so many different hats?
That's a great question. Yeah, and a lot of it, I mean, this was not planned. Certainly the business that I'm in now was completely unplanned, and that was serendipitous, with COVID and the opportunity. The military is something I've always wanted to do, and part of it was, my interest in aerospace in general. So I've always wanted to do something with the Air Force. I wanted to be an Air Force pilot. That's kind of my first big goal, and clearly that was not compatible with being a surgeon, not at that time, and also not being a U.S. citizen. That made it a little bit difficult. But along the way, so I had my core career, which is the clinical side. But with the PhD and my research interests, I knew I wanted to make that a major portion of what I do. There are a lot of people who do research kind of on the side, and they may get a paper or two here, and it's usually clinical. It's very difficult to actually be a funded basic science researcher as a clinician, let alone as a surgeon. So to be able to do that, you really need to be in an environment where they're supportive of that. So when I started at Ohio State University, they really did value the academics of medicine. As a surgical department, the surgical departments are generally the revenue generating department, for a lot of hospitals, universities, and cardiac surgery is even more so. So to be able to have some time put aside for research, your leadership has to value the academic side, because in general, when you look at it financially, it's a net loser. To have a surgeon who can bring in a fair amount of revenue, to take some of that person's time away to let them do research, usually you're losing money. But for an academic institution that values that and sees the long-term results, you get a lot of that back in other ways, in terms of your academic standing as a department and the research funding. So, for example, at Ohio State, when I started, they were ranked, I think, in the 30s in the US for research as a surgical department. When I left, they were in the top 10, and I just saw in an email not that long ago that they're number 4. And that has a lot of benefits to the university that may not be income generating in the short term, but you can imagine as you increase your academic stature, that will have the returns. So the whole point of that is, you need to be in a place where they value that. If you go to a university or an institution where they don't see the value of research, it's going to be hard to get the kind of support they need to have time, have resources, labs, and other types of support you need to have a successful research career. I think the other important thing is having the right environment where you have senior researchers who are willing to support you and help you in the beginning. So one of the drawbacks for physician scientists or challenges is that the vast majority will not have done a postdoc. And so you come out, so in my case, for example, I finished my MD PhD, went into 8 years of surgical training, and got into my first faculty position, and I'm at that point about 10 years out from the lab. So not only has the whole field changed during that time, but you've been out of that scientific realm in a lot of ways, and in terms of getting caught up with being able to write grants and be competitive against those who are doing full-time PhD work and who had the benefit of 2, 3, 4 years of postdoc training. So you need to have the right kind of support to be able to overcome those challenges. But a lot of this, it's all kind of an evolution. So the military, for example, I knew that wasn't going to be a full-time pursuit, but with the Guard, and you can also do this in the reserve, you can do it part-time. So I'm doing basically 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year, and I get to pursue that dream and goal that I've always had, to be not only in the military, but to be a flight surgeon, be able to fly and do that. So I think that's mostly it. Being in that environment, we have a boss and senior leadership that's able to do that. Now, having said that, I've left the academic clinical department, and I'm now in a non-academic hospital. And so I had to be a little more creative in terms of being able to continue my research. And having graduated from Brown, and with my hospital being 30 minutes from Brown, essentially working with Brown to be able to bring my research grants and academic appointments at Brown while having a clinical appointment responsibilities at the hospital. But that's very unconventional, but to make it work, I had to take advantage of some of the contacts and mentors and advisors I've had in the past to try and make that work. So, that's one of the important things I think that I've learned over the years is, make sure you have good mentors and advisors and people that look out for you, both short term and long term, because you never know when they're going to come back to be there for you. And actually, my boss in my clinical department was my former mentor when I was a resident, and my ultimate boss at Brown, who's the associate dean of research, was also my undergraduate thesis advisor. So, it really helps to keep in touch with those people, who've been a big part of your life. You never know when you'll need them, and it goes the other way around. For people, as you get older and you advance in your career, just think about giving back to those people who. That's one of the reasons I'm here, and I love doing this and sharing my experiences to help others.
Yeah, that's great. Those of you filing in, if you can write in the chat the program you're in and which department, that would be helpful for us. So that actually is like, and any questions, please write in the chat because I can keep going with questions. So the next question that's kind of segues with what you're talking about is mentorship. And we talk a lot about mentorship in graduate school. And it's one of the things we talk about, and you touched on, is having mentors throughout your career. Now, what if students want to venture off into something that's a little bit different? How would you, I guess, recommend students that aren't quite sure of where they want to go? How could they find potential mentors in, let's say, a new field of study if they want to try something new?
Yeah, I think, important thing is not to be shy. What I've found is people who are really passionate about what they do are also very passionate about sharing what they do. And whether it's just giving presentations and talks to their peers, or being able to share their experiences to the younger generation who are interested in learning from their experiences. The worst thing that can happen is they'll say, no, I'm not interested, but usually that doesn't happen. They may say, I'm a little bit busy, maybe they may refer you to someone else, or potentially be available in the future. But I would say the vast majority, at least willing to try and help. And I think many are sincerely interested in doing more than just providing a little advice. I've been involved in several professional organizations that have student groups or subgroups as part of the professional organization, and I think those are great places. So, for example, so I mentioned my interest in space, and when I was in medical school, my original goal was to work for NASA as a flight surgeon. And when I decided to do surgery, I knew I had to give up space as my primary career. But I knew that in order to be satisfied with having space as part of my life, I had to go out of my way to find opportunities to keep that. So surgery, obviously, as many of you know, is the training is long and rigorous, and the practice of it can also be very time consuming. And for me to be able to stay involved in the space field, again, I have to be a little creative and find opportunities. So what I did throughout, while I was in med school, and then as a resident and as faculty, I got involved in two organizations, both of which are the main organizations in their respective fields. So for example, for aerospace medicine, I got involved with the Aerospace Medical Association as a med student. I just found the organization. I joined. I didn't know anything about it. And one year, I just went to the meeting. I just showed up. And when I showed up, I looked like this lost medical student that I was. And one person who ended up becoming, a lifelong friend and a mentor, she basically grabbed me and says, "Hey, are you a student? Have you been here before?" And I said, "No, it's my first time." She took me to the meeting of the student and resident organization. And in 2 or 3 years, I was the president of the organization, and I have not missed a meeting in 22 years since that first meeting. And through that, I went through the ranks as a full fellow of the organization at a relatively young age, as one of the few people that was not actually doing aerospace medicine as part of my career. And so that opened up a lot of professional doors, and that just started by getting involved with the student group. And so these are mostly clinicians. And on the basic research side, there's another organization called the American Society for Gravitational Space Research. And this organization is made up of mostly PhDs, many of whom are funded by NASA, and they're doing plant or animal or physical sciences research in space or microgravity. And so I got involved with that group when I was a grad student with my mentor, Dr. Vandenberg. And from my experiences with the student group in asthma, the Aerospace Medical Association, I formed the student group for the ASGSR. And that group actually formed in 2020. So I was the founding president of the student group. I was out of that organization for about 8 years while I was finishing up my clinical work. I went back in as a faculty, and it was much to my surprise, and very pleasantly so, that group had grown from what we were maybe 12 or 15 students to 30, 40, 50. And that has become a key resource for students, so undergrad, grad students, and postdocs in terms of finding mentors. So they develop mentorship programs, et cetera. So many of these organizations have student groups. If they don't, what I did was actually form the student group. It took a little more work and effort, but just by forming the group, I became, I became a known entity among the leadership, right? Just taking on that initiative. And so that opened up a lot of doors. And actually at the time I was on the board as a student representative. And just last year I came off the board the second time around as a non-student representative. So that was a nice way to get back into it. Same with the Aerospace Medical Association. As part of the student group, I was on the council, and I went back on the council. Actually, I'm on it now. And again, that's a great way to get involved at a higher level professionally. And most organizations have something of something like that for students. And that's at a national professional level, even locally at your schools, universities, different organizations. Obviously, lecture series. They're just find people who are doing what you think you might want to do, and just reach out. I get probably on a weekly basis or several times a month, just random emails from people saying, "Hey, I read about your," and it's usually related to space. They've read about me or heard about me, or referred to me by someone else, and they just email, and I love responding to them. Sometimes I'll just respond and say, "Hey, I'm really busy, but maybe we can chat next week." But I'll make it a point to make sure I follow up. So don't be shy, just reach out. If they can't, they can't, but there are people out there who do what you may want to do, and just hear from them.
Reaching out. We have a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lee. That's it's been phenomenal learning from you so far, and your journey has been very inspiring. I just had a quick question regarding your decision-making framework, especially when it comes to like hard decisions. So, for instance, you mentioned at the tail end of your medical school, you have to make that decision between, do you pursue your lifelong goal of aerospace medicine, or do you go into surgery? Can you talk about how you made that decision, and just your decision-making framework in general?
Sure.
Think in advance.
And what do you do? What's your background?
So I'm currently a second-year master's student in the medical sciences, probably transfer to PhD, and then once that's done, go to medical school.
Okay. Or you can do both together at the same time.
I guess.
So yeah, so to answer your question, I guess I have never been one to be satisfied with having to just choose one. When I want to do multiple things or have multiple things, and I don't know if that's just being selfish, but if at all possible, I look at whether there's a way to not have to compromise. In the end, there's always some compromise, but not necessarily an all or none type of compromise. And when I was, for example, with the PhD and the MD, I was already in the MD track, but it was a decision to decide to commit to the PhD track. It's not only the extra 4 or 5, whatever years it takes to do that, but then afterwards to be able to try and pursue real research, not to disparage the outcomes of clinical research, but the type of research that requires funding in a lab, et cetera. and that is also a sacrifice down the line because, if you think about it, both in terms of, well, from a financial point, the more degrees you have and the more academic you become, probably the less money you make in general. And you would think it'd be the other way around, but ironically, it's not. So that for me was a decision as to whether I can do both. And so there was an opportunity to do both degrees, and I had a few mentors, not many, but there were a couple mentors who were MD PhDs who were successfully doing research and having a clinical practice. And so that gave me the confidence that, I think I could do this too. The surgical and aerospace medicine decision, that was very difficult because I had all along thought I was going to just be doing aerospace medicine. And it's no secret that I've always wanted to be an astronaut. Totally realizing that the chances of becoming an astronaut are minuscule, but I figured if I'm going to do it, and I'm going to go all out. But it's a little bit of a tangent, but I've talked to many astronauts, and I know many, and the advice I get from all of them is whatever you do, just make sure you're not making major career decisions based on just trying to be an astronaut, because you probably won't, no matter how good of a candidate you may be. You just want to make sure you don't regret your decisions just because you tried to become an astronaut and you failed. So you got to enjoy the journey and the process. And so I think that's very valuable advice. So probably the main advice that helped me make that decision was someone had told me, you can be a surgeon and do some aerospace medicine or research on the side. You can't be in aerospace medicine and be a surgeon on the side. And I knew that if I did just aerospace medicine and I wasn't doing surgery, I'd probably regret it and I wouldn't be completely satisfied. So that in the end was what helped me decide that I was going to pursue surgery. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, I found ways to get actively involved. And so while pursuing surgery at a high level, I was able to reach kind of the highest ranks professionally in the aerospace medical field as a full fellow and as also a member of the International Academy of Astronautics, which is an internationally recognized organization and kind of a selective group, and then on the research side as well. So that is, it was really a matter of seeing a vision and a path where I can potentially do both. If there may be times where there is no path, and you just have to choose. But fortunately, I think I've been lucky, fortunate, creative enough to be able to find paths, and probably most importantly, I've had and found mentors or individuals who've been successful in different areas and learn from them.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Nicholas, you had a question. You want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, you briefly actually addressed the question for a second, but it was just if you have any thoughts or comments on this balance between being a trainee and earning degrees, as you said, and like delaying this start of prime earning years. Was it never a choice for you? You always had this goal of doing medicine, space, and research, and it was just pursuing that at all ends, or was there a consideration of the delay of the earning years?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think part of it may be maybe I was a little naive in my earlier years, which is not that long ago actually. When I think about it, that in the end everything will work out. So the path through med school and residency was very clear to me. You go finish your undergrad, go to med school, go to residency, and then you're a surgeon. And I did not know of any surgeons, who were not at least, financially comfortable, right? At least. And so I figured, and I know a lot of people come out with huge debts, and without having actually done the calculations, I just figured, well, in the end, I'll be able to pay off my debts and I'll be fine. But that was in the context of, going right through and without that extra years of research and extra degrees. And so certainly having done that added many years. I had no plans. I did not foresee, when I would get married and have children. Those things kind of happen as you're going through the career. And I have to give a lot of credit to my wife and my family for putting up with all of this, because when I think about it, my peers who never did anything else but just go through the track. So to give you an example, when I met my wife and we were getting married, I told her, I was planning to do emergency medicine and I'll be done in 3 years. And that was like, not even the PhD part, if you think about it. So my 3-year residency became a 5-year general surgery plus 2 years of cardiac plus another year of transplant. It became 8 years. And so it is a sacrifice. It's a big delay in terms of when you start making real income. So as I tell everyone, I didn't have my first job till I was 41. But quite frankly, as a cardiothoracic surgeon, I have a good salary. Right? I just started really late. I only paid off my student loans, about a year or two ago. But now I'm comfortable. But I'm still catching up to those who started working 20 years before me, even though their salary may be much smaller. So I never thought of that as a major consideration because, even though I had a lot of loans getting to that point, I was able to pay bills, and I knew ultimately I'd get there. So a lot of it also involves having family who are supportive of that process. I don't know if that helps, answers your question at all, but.
Sure. I mean, I just thought I'd pick your brain. I appreciate the perspective.
Yeah. Welcome, Sophia. Did you have a question, or you just wanted to see everyone? It's nice to put your camera on. That's nice. Hi.
Hi, I'm sorry, I just missed the first hour because I was in another meeting.
Yeah.
But I'm really impressed with your journey, and I was wondering if you can do anything else back then. Would you do something different?
Mm-hmm.
Like, do you regret any of your steps? Or want to change it a little bit? And you said that you started later your career, like in 41, to be an actual surgeon. But if you go back, would you change anything?
Yeah, everyone has some regrets. And I would say most of them are relatively small. I'm very grateful for the opportunities I've had and where I am. I think if I knew back then all the things I knew now, I think I would have been more efficient in terms of how I spent my time. For example, during the PhD years, I guess I really enjoyed the PhD years and the research I was doing. So I kind of took my time going through that process. I think I could have shaved a year or two off of that if I had just kind of, really focused in and just gone through it. Maybe I would have, in retrospect, maybe done that. But during that time, extra few years, I've gained a lot of professional experience, etc. One thing as an undergrad, there are two regrets I have as an undergrad, which doesn't really have a big impact in my career now, is when I was at Brown University. Brown has one of, if not the premier planetary geology department in the country. And the head of that, Professor Jim Head, was a geologist who trained the Apollo astronauts. And he was, kind of a mentor or advisor to me as well, even though I wasn't in the program with my interest in space. And he sent me to a few workshops at NASA JPL, et cetera. And to this day, I don't know why it didn't dawn on me that I should have just majored in planetary geology, because it's there and it's an opportunity. And the other big regret is not having done engineering and gotten a formal engineering degree, because what I do now is really more bioengineering. I'm also in the had an appointment in bioengineering at Ohio State University, but I didn't have a formal bioengineering engineering degree. And I don't think it really had any practical impact, but I think it would have been a nice thing to have. And maybe some of that also is related to my interest in becoming an astronaut, because every little bit. So when you think about astronauts, so I don't know if this was mentioned, but I was one of the finalists for the Canadian astronaut program back in 2016, I think. And if you look up the Canadian Space Agency website, it's probably still listed up there, one of the final 72. And I think there are more things I could have done to focus in on that, but again, that wasn't the focus. But there are always regrets. You think you could have done a little bit more. But overall, I'm very happy with where things have, how it has evolved. How could I not be satisfied with the fact that, I'm doing cardiac surgery and saving lives on a regular basis. I'm funded by NASA and the NIH and doing research, in the military, and able to do that. And now I have a company. We'll see where that goes, but hopefully we'll be successful. And the educational and outreach part is also something I've always really enjoyed. So I really enjoy these opportunities.
Yeah, I want to touch on a little bit about this regrets thing. So the way I think of regrets is, at that time, so going back to Sophia's question, at that time, you made the best decision with the information that you had, right? That's the way you should kind of look at life. And then later on, it's only with hindsight, you may realize, oh, I could have done this a little bit differently. So I try not to frame it as a regret. You kind of frame it as what would you have done differently, what knowing that you know now, kind of thing. Roberta has a question. So I just want to, since we have an intimate group here, I usually stop recording and then people will come on and ask personal questions, but it looks like people are on a roll. So, and I know some people, they couldn't make it tonight. They're going to watch the recording later. So is it all right if I just keep on recording till about 5 minutes till? Everybody okay with that? All right. Roberta, you had a question from Ottawa, right?
From Ottawa. I am not from Ottawa.
Oh, yeah, Ottawa.
I'm from UofT. But Dr. Lee and Dr. Lee, thank you much for setting this up. This is really amazing to hear from you. So my question is, I'm very early on in my medical career. I'm in first year medical school. And when you were talking about taking a year to go to France to the International Space University, I thought that was really interesting. And I was just wondering if you could talk more about that experience and what it was like to take a year from your medical school learning and then return to it later. And then also if you have any advice for an early on medical student, that would be great.
Well, I can talk a lot about taking time off because I've done a lot of that. So yes, and it goes all the way back to when I was an undergrad. I took a year off as a sophomore or second year to go to Korea. So the other big thing in my life was Taekwondo. So I was back before college, I was in Olympic trials, the bronze medalist, and I've always wanted to try out for the next Olympics, which was in '92. And I told my mom after my first year, I was like, I'm going to take a year off and I'm going to go to Korea and train for the Olympic trials next year. And of course, my mom flipped out and says, no, you are not taking any time off of school to do Taekwondo. So, being the person I am, I didn't, I wasn't satisfied with that, but I couldn't, disobey my mom. So I looked around and I found Brown has an exchange program with Korea. And so I told my mom, I'm going to do my sophomore year in Korea. And it just happens I can train while I'm there. And so I took a year off, did that, and came back. And then when I switched into the MD PhD program, took that year off in France. To me, when I think about these years off, it's really a 1 year or 2 year, whatever it is, investment in the rest of your life. This is, so if you're 25 and you've got 40 plus years of your life, career ahead of you, and taking a year off, whether it's to do an additional degree or spend a year somewhere where it may be life-changing, that's a small investment in my mind. And again, when at that age, 1 year is not that much time. My 1 year became 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years, very quickly. But at every stage, at least in my own mind, I was able to justify how this was part of my big picture plan, not really knowing how it was going to impact it. The International Space University in France was actually a very key part of my journey, in the sense that up to that point, other than my indirect experience, doing space-related work with my advisor in the lab over the summer before I started the PhD, I had no direct access to the space world. And so, having spent a year at the International Space University, I took Russian in college specifically because of my space interests. I mean, that's how kind of fanatical I was. And so when I went to France, basically I could choose anywhere I wanted to go for 3 years. And I chose to go to Russia and work there and on their project. But that year opened up so many doors for me, because essentially I was working with and had exposure to some of the top people and top minds in the space field. And as an alumni of the organization, we have access to a whole community of the space world. And so from there, actually, while I was there, I had an opportunity I was selected to have an experiment on the space shuttle. And so that was my first actual experiment as a student that flew on the space shuttle. And just coincidentally, it happened to be on John Glenn's flight, 1998. And so because of that, there was a lot of media around that. And so, not that my experiment was anything special, but because I was a student and I was at Brown, and they were looking for some Brown connection with this historic flight with John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth and now the oldest person to go into space, I got a lot of media attention. And that actually was one of the big reasons I think I got my green card, because I didn't have a good way to get a green card in the US, because I was there as a student. There's no path to citizenship as a student. And I got it as a national interest waiver. And so my attorney was able to put together a really nice package and say, hey, look at, Peter Lee, and he was in the news, we had an experiment with John Glenn, and it made it seem like much more than it was, because, my experiment was pretty, a simple experiment. And so all these little things, I would never have known that was going to be a major contributor to something as major as having an opportunity to, get my citizenship. As an aside, it took me 22 years to get my citizenship, even though I spent my entire adult life, in the U.S. But that was something that another pursuit that took some effort and creativity, because again, I had to find a way to get that. So I don't know if that answers your question in terms of my thought of a year here or here or there. I think is a very worthwhile investment, as long as it makes sense. It's got to fit in. And that decision to do the MPH, even though that wasn't an extra year, I did it in place of my 4th year of clinical rotations. I lost a year of electives because of that, but in turn, I got not only an extra degree, but it was a Harvard degree, which carries some weight. But more importantly, because of my experience with databases and clinical studies, throughout my research, my 5 years of general surgery, I was the go-to research guy, because I was able to manage databases and do my own analyses and statistics, and had multiple papers and abstracts throughout that time. And that wouldn't have happened without that MPH year. And I get asked this a lot too. Some people just need to take a year off, whether they're applying to medical school or looking for extra experience, or just need time off to figure out what they want to do. I think that's time well spent when you're talking about making what may be, the right decision or best decision for yourself for the rest of your career. That takes a year of your life. It's worth it.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear your experience because, taking a year off once getting into medicine for me, I just didn't even think that was possible to do. I just sort of thought, okay, I'm going to start medical school and then finish it. I guess that's sort of the path I thought I was going to take, but it's so interesting to hear a sort of unorthodox way to do it.
Yeah, and depending on, even as when you're finishing medical school, looking at residencies, if you're trying to get into a very competitive residency, it sometimes it's worth taking that extra year to do additional research or whatever it might be to get into the right residency or the specialty you want to get into. And I get and talk to people who've done it, who have different opinions. And it's one thing I've always told people: find people who love what they do and find people who hate what they do, and kind of get both perspectives, and then see how those apply to you.
Thank you so much.
Nana, you never invite people who hate what they do to these sessions.
Shocker. Zanping, did you have a question? Or you're just listening?
Yeah, I'm just listening.
Okay. Yeah.
Interesting question.
So Zanping is a master's student at Johns Hopkins. So actually, I'm working with him on a project. So one of my NASA grants, looking at muscle atrophy in a simulated microgravity environment. So he's working on that at Johns Hopkins.
Cool. Well, welcome. Thanks for coming. So actually, kind of bridging off of the last question, you have a PhD and an MD. And so what sort of advice would you give to PhD students, to MD students, and for those that are in both MD, PhD? Like, what sort of specific advice would you give to those three different types of students in their scientific career?
Well, maybe I'll start with the MD, PhD, because I think one of the main reasons that there are MD, PhD programs is to be able to bridge that gap between the bench research and the clinical application of that research. And that translational aspect is sometimes lost in a lot of areas of research. So one example, so I talked about the two organizations I was very involved in: Aerospace Medical Association and the Space Biology Organization. So on one side, they talk a lot about muscle wasting and bone loss and neurovestibular changes that the flight surgeons and the physiologists deal with in astronauts. And so they're doing a lot of that kind of research in mostly humans. Then I go to this other meeting, and those are mostly physiologists or MDs. And then 6 months later, the Space Biology Organization, I go there, and they're all PhDs. I'm one of the only MDs or MD PhD there. And they're talking about the same type of research, except it's in animals or cells, cell culture. And the two sides don't talk to each other. They don't know each other. There are very few people that kind of cross-pollinate the two sides. And it just happened that I was on the board of one and the executive council of the other. And what I really tried to do is bring the two sides together and find commonalities. But if you're in a hospital setting and you have a basic science lab, I think I find it very rewarding that I can be in a environment where I'm talking to other PhD colleagues and we're talking about the basic research, and then they'll often turn to me and say, so how would this apply? Would be useful in a clinical setting, and it says a lot to be able to speak to that in a real practical manner. And the flip side is true. I'm talking to my MD colleagues who don't do any research, and I could talk to them about the research, the great research that's happening in the building right next door that they don't even know about, and they don't know how it could potentially apply. So having said that, being able to straddle both sides. If you're on one side of the fence or the other, I would propose to try and learn as much as you can about the other side, and whether you can directly do that or not, find partners or advocates who can help bridge that. So if you're a PhD researcher doing, looking at arrhythmias in the heart and working on rats or animals, find a partner who really wants to work with you, who treats patients, who has access to patients, and find that partnership, because you mutually have an interest in addressing that disease, and you have unique perspectives, but you kind of need each other as well. But sometimes it takes that extra effort to reach out and find that connection. Whether there's an intermediary like an MD PhD type person or not, finding that connection will help advance your research. And it also has a lot of practicalities for grants. Right? So a lot of grants, they want to see that if there's something clinical there, they want to see someone with a clinical perspective on the grant. And so they know that, oh, okay, this, there's an MD here and that actually treats these patients. They have that perspective. So this is a complete team. It's not a team of just people very focused in that one area. And the same thing applies for a MD applying for some grant that has some component that may really benefit from having a basic scientist on there with that kind of background and pedigree.
Any other questions? We've got 2 minutes. So I guess to close, you talked a lot about being creative. And I think your entire journey was about being creative and finding compromises and working with various partners and going to South Korea as an exchange to work on your Taekwondo because your mom said, no, you can't take a year off school. So creativity has been a hallmark of your entire journey. Are there any other skills that you want to give as sort of your last words of advice to everyone that they should work on to last their entire career, not just the first job, but for their entire pathway?
Well, I can tell you that when I would say right up into even medical school, certainly throughout college, I hated public speaking. And the only time I actually felt comfortable was when I was doing Taekwondo. I'd be up there and I'd be, people would tell me like I'm a different person because, I'm just there and I'm yelling orders and this and that. But, in a classroom, I never rose my hand. I never spoke. I never, volunteered to talk. And I think I did myself a disservice by doing that. And it was actually when I was at the International Space University, when I was in France. So that program, there were 33 students from 23 countries. And I'd say maybe a quarter of them were like native English speakers, and the rest, were speaking English as a second language. And it gave me an opportunity to kind of take more of a standout and take a leadership role. Interestingly, I've always taken on leadership roles, but I didn't like to speak out. So I was a co-president of my high school, and I was president of various groups, but I was still very reserved. And that year I said, you know what, I need to get comfortable with this. And I forced myself, every time there was an opportunity, I put my hand up and I spoke. And if there was a presentation, I volunteered to give the presentation. And I gained a lot of confidence just doing that. And I just got comfortable to a point where I actually started enjoying it, because I felt like, you know what, actually, I know what I'm talking about and I'm making a difference. And then from that point on, it became more natural to do it. Like I didn't have to force myself and think about it. Say, okay, I should say something or I should volunteer. I just wanted to do it. I think that helped a lot in terms of being able to speak comfortably and with some authority. It's very clear, and I'm sure you see it. Someone who gets up in front of a crowd and you can tell they're not comfortable, or a lot of ums, and they're not comfortable doing that. And I think I was like that, in my early years. So get out of your comfort zone. and be honest with yourself. Find what your weaknesses are. Some of you are already probably, very good at it, but if you're not, find a way to kind of get out of that comfort zone and address it head on, and then make it a strength as opposed to a weakness. So that was just kind of one example of that. But I think that can apply to almost anything, whether it's your organizational skills or how you manage your time or anything like that. Just be honest with yourself. Find what your weakness, what you wish you could do better, and then you just gotta one day say, you know what, I'm gonna address it. I'm gonna do it, as uncomfortable as it is. And over time, I think it just becomes your thing. And now you're no longer uncomfortable. It becomes a strength.
All good words of advice. So I want to thank Dr. Kimberly for being with us today. Dr., Lieutenant Colonel, Master, 4 different titles. So thank you for spending your hour where you could have been doing tons of other things to share your story with our mentees today. And thank you for joining us in this hour and sharing this journey.
And if anyone has any individual questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out. Do they have my contact?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me, and then I can give maybe your Brown email if that works with you, Dr. Lee.
Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you for putting another hour of Zoom on behalf of the Temerty Faculty of Medicine. Thanks for joining. And next month, we'll be talking to Daryl Vaz, who's the president of MedGCOM, so Scientific Communications. And just a shout out to all you that are doing research and in medical school for this past year. It's been a rough year. So trophy to you all for continuing on with the scientific enterprise, going into lab, trucking in, even through these crazy times in their schedule. Thank you so much for all that you do, scientists. Okay, so stay safe. Bye for now.
Hi, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
And those of you watching at home, thanks for joining. Bye.
Thanks, Nana. Thanks, Dr. Lee. Take care.
Bye.